How's it going, everyone? Kind of hoping this weather can make up its mind. Going to Nashville for a wedding this weekend, so things are pretty good on my end. Wish these conversations could be more of a two-way, but it's the nature of asynchronous. Let's jump right in. So, going off of post-internet media, just to review very quickly, it we had these reduced communication costs. People are able to talk to each other much more easily. Less gatekeeping. So not only is it cheaper to talk, but more people are able to do it. And because of that, you have, for listeners, there's an increased supply and options of what you want to listen to. So we sort of see this fragmenting and people falling into more niche groups. And then people would just go on the internet and tell lies, right? So mis, dis, and malinformation. And so when there were only a few newspapers or only a few news channels, they could filter issues down, all the world's events down, and really present what they wanted the viewers to see. Like we talked about how there is basically no coverage of JFK's alleged affairs, and compare that to something like Drudge Report and Monica Lewinsky. It's more of a salacious example, but you get my point. So this entire week is dedicated to interest groups. Um, So this is mainly what they are. And then on Thursday, we'll be going over their legal justification and how they are actually able to influence politics. So what are interest groups, types of interest groups, and their place in sort of wider theory. So what are interest groups? Well, on average, they want two things, or really they want one thing and to avoid a second thing. What they want is to influence policy. Um, and there's a little bit more to it that we'll get into in a second. But what they really don't want, and sort of a hard line we can say is like, this is not an interest group if it has this, is that interest groups generally do not want to hold office themselves. Sort of the caricature people get of interest groups are like Grimo Wormtongue from The Two Towers, Lord of the Rings. Sort of this self-obsessed, malignant, bad actor who influences policy. It's sometimes the case, sometimes not. It's really in the eye of the beholder or what you specifically find to be interesting. For example, if you are very pro-environment, you're going to look at an environmental interest group differently than an oil interest group, and vice versa. So, as popular as it is to dunk on interest groups, odds are that there is one interest group that pushes for policy in a direction that you personally would like to see. More likely than not. Going into more detail, other than just a group that wants to push policy but doesn't want to hold office, we can also say that there are two more factors, that there's a membership structure. So you can either join or work for this organization. And that would mean that, like, say let's continue on with the environmentalist example. If I were an environmentalist and I was really pushing for policy, just me by myself does not make me an interest group because I'm just one person. Or say my wife and I really care about it and we push for green policy together. Well, there's no membership structure there. So even though we're a group, there's no leaders or anything like that. So that's not an interest group. But when you get to the World Wildlife Fund or something like that, where they have funding, they have leadership, they have members, they have volunteers, that's when it becomes an interest group. So you need a membership structure and shared interests. which is the opposite of what I was talking about. So say there's an organization that stands for nothing. My Warhammer group on Facebook uh, doesn't push for policy at all. We don't have any shared interests other than Warhammer. So that's not going to be an interest group either. Even then, it's still pretty broad what is and is not an interest group. And that's going to be a reoccurring theme. Interest groups sort of thrive in these legal gray areas on what is and is not an interest group. So to say that, there's this one definition that describes all interest groups and excludes everything that's not an interest group is a very tall order. Like when I was a kid, you got to go out of class if you went to the meetings for this group called 4-H. I forget what it stands for, but it's pro agriculture. And so, like, I got out of French class, I believe. Where I lived, we had to learn French in primary school. But I got out of French class to go learn about farming, and it's 4-H an interest group. Well, they just want to talk to kids about farming and push some pro-agricultural policies, but it's not their main thing. So it's hard to define. So because it's so hard to define what is and isn't an interest group, let's look at some examples and work through them together to see what we think. So the first one is, well, it's actually two cases for the first one. The Green Party and the Libertarian Party. So they have membership structures. They advocate for specific policies. Sorry, my phone went off. They advocate for specific policies, but they do want to run for office. So that would make them not interest groups, it would make them political parties. And even though these are third parties that seldom ever win, they still don't count as interest groups. AFL-CIO, American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, basically very pro-union group. Don't run for office, have a membership structure, have shared interests among the members, and advocate for a specific policy, in this case, pro-union policy. Let's take a second. Is this an interest group? Sounds like it so far, but maybe this is a trick question. All right, if you said that it is an interest group, you are correct. Another one you'll see is a lot of interest groups will they'll hide behind the most agreeable language possible if they know what they're advocating for is controversial. So one great example is Citizens United. We're going to get into Citizens United at the end. They are an interest group advocating for a specific policy that was very unpopular and still remains unpopular. And another one that comes to mind is the Free Speech Coalition. What they push for, no moral judgments on how you specifically feel about it, but I suspect that they are not open about what they advocate for, who they get all their money from, because they know that Free Speech Coalition is more palatable for general audiences, we'll say. So they are an interest group. They have membership, they don't run for office, they have shared goals, and they all advocate for a policy. So take a second and guess what the Free Speech Coalition advocates for, what kind of free speech they specifically care about. Now, if you said hate speech and this is a hate group, you are actually incorrect. The free speech they advocate for is pornography. So this is the pro-porn interest group. Then we get into murkier territory with Human Rights Watch, American Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders. They advocate for policy, have membership structures, don't run for office. So I would consider them an interest group. Other people would say that they are NGOs or non-governmental organizations, and they can or cannot be mutually exclusive. But they're not known for being interest groups, even though they check all the same boxes. And then the last one are charitable organizations. So the United Methodist Church, Order of Franciscans, two groups of Christians that do a lot of community activism, social justice. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America, United Way. All these groups focus on either religion or charity or religion through charity. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, I believe the Boy Scouts have a religious element, but the Girl Scouts don't. The United Way has no religious element. Which of these would you consider to be interest groups? It's tough, right? And like I said, interest groups and what they are and aren't sort of thrive in this weird gray area, which is why we're taking a whole module to discuss this. Because interest groups are so legalistic and know that they are not popular in themselves, most people don't like interest groups. They try to be murky and muddy the waters about what is and is not an interest group, which can ironically make people dislike interest groups even more sometimes. So a quick guide as to, and like I said, this isn't going to be 100%, but quick guide as to what is not an interest group, formal enough to have members, not running for political office. If they're pushing people for political office, that pretty explicitly tips them over into being a political party. They'll advocate for values, values that are specific enough to be foreign or domestic policy. And so what is this, like anything with a membership structure where people don't run for office? So we talked about like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. I don't know about the Girl Scouts, but I know the Boy Scout leadership tends to run pretty conservative, so it's right-leaning group. But there's no Boy Scout party, or there's no Boy Scouts of America party. So would you consider that to be an interest group? There's arguments to be made for both sides. They don't normally push for any specific policy that I know of. So it gets to be, like I said, very complicated. A lot of interest groups are made up of or funded by a bunch of different corporations, normally in one field. So like the API, American Petroleum Institute, different companies within the oil and gas industry fund the API, which pushes for policy that helps the oil and gas industry. And you see other stuff too. The defense industry has interest groups, medical industry, the same. So a lot of interest groups are solely focused on assisting for-profit corporations. And their logic for it is that, well, these for-profit corporations are important to the general well-being of all Americans, so it's a policy issue. Yeah. And then there's other corporation-focused interest groups that corporations actually tend to not like. So AFL-CIO, the pro-union interest group, so a collection of unions that advocate for pro-union policy. Their internal logic is they're helping corporations too. They're not helping the bottom line. in a very profit and loss sort of sense, but they're helping the overall health of the corporation by improving the wages, working conditions, everything that goes into what a union advocates for. So it's both pro and anti-corporation in a very interesting way. And another type of interest group we'll see is a more race-based one or ethnicity-based one. So here's 4 examples that I could come up with. There's the Hibernian societies, which are used to be bigger deals than they are now, but it's societies of Irish Americans. Then there's more politically charged ones, Armenian National Committee, which focuses on the Armenian diaspora. For those who don't know, there's a genocide in Armenia and brought a lot of Armenians to the United States. And when I say there's a genocide, there was a genocide in Armenia. That's according to 49 states. I believe Mississippi never actually recognized the Armenian genocide, or at least until very recently, it did not recognize the Armenian genocide. Don't know what that was about, but anyway. One that you've probably heard of in middle school or high school is the NAACP, so advocating for Black Americans. And then, because I watch so many mafia movies, of course, you always hear about the National Italian American Foundation. I remember Robert De Niro was supposed to win an award from them for his, he's Italian American, he's in a lot of movies. But then there was a big internal fight because he normally played mafia guys, and that was a negative Italian stereotype. Now, when you look at race-based interest groups, some people can cross the line into thinking that these are hate groups. There's a pretty important difference between the two. Race-based interest groups are normally advocating for inclusion and equality, while hate groups are normally advocating for exclusion and some sort of perceived racial superiority. Now, could you consider these to be interest groups because they have membership structures and they push for, albeit hateful policy, but still policy? That goes into the murky argument again, right? Other people would say that they are too on the fringes of society, and are actively often countered by the government. Famously, Ulysses S. Grant drove out a lot of the KKK. Well, the first generation of the KKK, at least. And then you could also say that they're too fragmented to really have a leadership structure. So I believe that there's no central leadership between like different cells of Aryan Brotherhood or KKK. So personally, I wouldn't consider them interest groups. I would say hate groups are their own category. But how you feel about that is really up to you. Okay, instead of the KKK, let's talk about something nice. Pandas, or the WWF. Now, for those of you who are in the know, WWF, of course, stands for the World Wrestling Federation. It's a joke. The World Wrestling Federation was the name of a for-profit wrestling organization that the World Wildlife Fund, or the Panda one, there was a lawsuit between the two over which gets to be called the WWF. Obviously, one of them changed their name, the other one's still around, so you can guess who won. It was the World Wildlife Fund that is now the WWF. And the World Wrestling Federation is now the WWE, or World Wrestling Entertainment. Then, of course, sometimes interest groups will form up and make super interest groups, like all these energy and environmental groups. Another way that they will advocate for policy is through research. I would hesitate to say independent research because normally they find exactly what they are looking for, but it's still research organizations, and some are more biased than others. There's the Center for American Progress and the Human Rights Campaign, which lean pretty heavy to the left. I remember during the 2016 election, the Human Rights Campaign uh, made a big deal about its abbreviation being HRC. Um, so you can tell who they would go for in the 2016 election. Um, Even if you don't get the policy, you can probably see the pattern that HRC also stands for Hillary Rodham Clinton. And on the right, you have stuff like the Heritage Foundation, who I believe did Project 2025, which I guess was supposed to be last year. I don't know how that turned out. I never read Project 2025. And the more libertarian Cato Institute. I don't know if it stands for anything or if it's a reference to the Roman politician. Personally, I've been more of a fan of Cicero my whole life, but still. Now, these researching interest groups will put together a report. So they will get a bunch of money from pro-environmentalist groups, donors, and stuff like that. Put a report, and then what do you know? All the research they find is very in favor or has policy recommendations for increasing green energy and stuff like that. These are often called think tanks. And just like all people have a bias, all think tanks have a bias. So it's not to say that they're bad things, um, but it's important to recognize that they do have interests and donors and people they feel accountable to. Now, when people think interest groups, they generally think about the principal agents in them, which are called lobbyists, and sometimes interest groups are called lobbies. This is the lobbyist, I forgot his name, Remy, I think, from House of Cards. Um, yeah, not a good show, by the way, but unless you went to the Citadel, it's not worth watching, in my opinion. Other people really liked it, but yeah, I did not. We'll go more into political action committees, super PACs, and lobbyists on Thursday. But open secrets, you can find out what lobbies are funding what politicians, and it's generally quite interesting. There was an old joke that said, and forgive me if I've said this one before, politicians should wear their sponsors on their clothes like NASCAR drivers. Um, we don't have that, of course, but Open Secrets is the best alternative we have so far. And often, especially during election season, you'll see the ads where they always say paid for by X organization, and we'll go into more detail on this later too. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have donated money to that politician. They're just running independent ads in that politician's favor. Um, there's some legal gray area to how they can do that, and both the right and left does it. So, still. Once I went with my dad to some work stuff he had at the Tennessee legislature in Nashville, and I remember walking around there and meeting, my dad meeting with a guy he knew in an elevator. A quick talk. I think the guy had like invited my dad to like lunch or something. I was like 14. I was like not paying attention. and I asked who he was after he got off the elevator, and my dad's like, "Oh, he's a lobbyist. He's a gun for hire." I was like, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And he goes, "He makes a ton of money." And so when it go home, and I was like, okay, well, I like political science, American civics, stuff like that. And I would also like to make a ton of money. So I remember looking up on the lobbyist website as to what a lobbyist does, what you need to be one. And most of them had actually said that you need to work at Capitol Hill before you're a lobbyist. They're just very explicitly on the website. Then I found out that they're widely disliked and stuff like that, so I never became one. Point being, though, is that a lot of lobbyists will work on Capitol Hill before they become lobbyists. And what that sets off is this revolving door issue. They have connections that they make while they're either politicians or working for politicians. And they don't make that much money compared to what a lobbyist does. But then they give up that power for a ton of money so they can influence votes. So to be a lobbyist, often you have to start as a politician or working for a politician. A great example, I don't know what he's more famous for, but Paul Ryan. So in 2012, he was Mitt Romney's VP pick. And then 2016, I believe, he became Speaker of the House. So 2 heartbeats away from the presidency. At the time, it was Trump, Pence, and if something had happened to them, Paul Ryan would have been president. Which sounds outlandish, but one Speaker of the House has actually become president before. Give you a second to think about who that was. It's Gerald Ford, after the Nixon scandal. Spiro Agnew, the VP, resigned before Nixon did, and then Ford went into the White House. But after Paul Ryan lost in 2012, 2013, so going one Republican, one Democrat, to show you that both sides do this, Kyrsten Sinema is elected to Congress and eventually Senate out of Arizona. And yeah, celebrated as the first openly bisexual member of Congress. Now, what I'm not saying is that either one of these people were bribed. I am not saying that. Please do not take that away, that they were bribed. But there is a confluence of events that is very interesting, that I'm sure both sides and their lawyers and their fans all have a very concise, legally sound excuse for. But the revolving door also works in another way, which is retirement. So Paul Ryan, a speaker and his time in Congress, stopped a bunch of taxing the rich bills. So did Kyrsten Sinema. I believe she held up one vote in the Senate. Like, she was the deciding vote that held it up. Who cares at first, right? I mean, this is following the 2008 financial crisis bailout. Politicians advocating for rich people isn't anything new. Well, what's interesting about this is where they ended up after they had this great track record of defending large businesses while making politician dollars, which, like I said, with lobbyists isn't a lot compared to how much they can make. Well, with the Tea Party wave starting off in 2012, Paul Ryan already on the ropes a bit. He falls out of favor with Donald Trump. During his first term, a lot of people fell out of favor with Donald Trump. So Paul Ryan eventually left politics. And like I said, wasn't a bribe. but you can say he cashed into a very comfortable, high-paying job at Solamare Capital. Now, Kyrsten Sinema is a bit different because she was specifically elected to fight the rich. I mean, she's Democrat, so she can rally around that kind of stuff more. Thing is, she got into office, and like we discussed, didn't fight the rich, ended up siding with the rich a lot of the time, and then ended up, after she was voted out of office, getting a very high-paying, comfortable job at Hogan Lovells. So, not a bribe, just a very interesting confluence of events because Hogan Lovells and Solamare Capital are both private equity firms that really advocate for the rich and make a lot of money for the rich. Now, going back to more race and ethnicity focused groups, we have Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. They serve a very interesting purpose in US government because, like I said, these are interest groups. They don't run for office. There's no ADL or SPLC candidate. So they're not advocating for policy that way. But what they do is something very interesting. Now, we've talked a lot about how politicians don't want accountability. And that's a right and left thing, is you don't want to be locked into something that's popular now, but could be unpopular later. Hillary Clinton's Iraq War vote, great example. So when the government is asked to define what a hate group is, well, it's a bit of an issue because the government isn't really often very willing in defining what a hate group is. It could be a huge voting bloc later. It could antagonize a specific group of voters that they want to keep. So instead of politicians and the agencies they run denoting what a hate group is a lot of the time, often they'll outsource it to interest groups that have functions like the SPLC and ADL. So this is actually Andy Kaufman, but it's from one of his bits when he's just saying, "Don't look at me." A very funny bit, by the way. It's a joke about carrying a cannon up a hill. I would butcher it, but politicians are essentially saying, "Don't look at me. I'm going to outsource, or we're going to outsource how we define these things because it looks bad when the government defines it." So the Southern Poverty Law Center has what's called the hate map, or random, or not random, but locations of where they feel hate groups are. And to do that, they have to define what is a hate group. And so often what you'll see, especially in like congressional testimony, politicians won't say, trying to look at any example here, Alaska has X amount of hate groups. They won't say that. They'll say, according to the SPLC, Alaska has X amount of hate groups. The ADL does something similar, but instead of groups, they have hate symbols, a database of hate symbols that politicians can defer to. So if a politician, great example, the swastika. The ADL will define a swastika as a hate symbol, so a politician doesn't have to. And you might be thinking, well, why doesn't a politician want to define a swastika as a hate symbol? Because in especially Japanese and Korean cultures, it's a Buddhist symbol. And these are kind of one of those things where, like, when they're doing, they're doing their job when you don't hear about them at all. So the ADL arguably did more harm than good when it added the OK hand gesture into its database as being a racist hand sign. I'm not going to say the words, but they're there on the screen as to what the OK hand gesture was supposed to represent or what they had said represented. But according to them, if someone was doing this hand gesture, it was a dog whistle or like a secret code among white supremacists that mean this phrase that I'm not going to say, but you can see on the screen. Now, the problem with that is that it's a very broad hand gesture, and that people have been making this hand gesture for a very, very, very long time. I don't know if any of you are into scuba diving, but you can't talk when you're scuba diving, so you have to do a lot of hand gestures, and the OK hand gesture is, I think, pretty universal among scuba divers. And I don't think Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, or Paul McCartney are white supremacists or secret white supremacists, and they're trying to dog whistle to people. Now, this really became a big conversation in 2019, where a lot of people were saying, well, it's actually been racist all along, and you just fell for it. So Obama, Paul McCartney, Ronald Reagan all fell for it, but didn't know any better. And then others had said, well, it's been co-opted. And so I don't know if these guys are in a hate group or not. But I mean, one of them's wearing a Pinochet did nothing wrong shirt. So I'm going to assume that they're right wing. Point being is that the ADL kind of accidentally created a new right wing symbol. I'm not going to put a picture of it up, but I'm not even going to say the shooter's name or where it was, but there was a mass shooter who, before going on the shooting spree, did the OK hand sign, so sort of mock the ADL. And like I said, bottom line, ADL sort of accidentally created a new hate symbol. And that's more domestic policies, and I don't think most people would consider the OK hand signal to be a hate symbol. I don't even know if it's still in the ADL database. But going into foreign policy, it gets testy also. So there are the October 7th attacks that some would consider to be a terrorist attack, and others would not consider it to be a terrorist attack. They'd consider it to be war crimes or something else. And that's because there's no internationally recognized definition of terrorism. And so you take like the OK hand sign and then you make it into something that's a much more testy issue where more lives are at stake. The Human Rights Watch and AIPAC are great examples in how we define terrorism. AIPAC, or the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, said that the October 7th attacks were terrorism, where the Human Rights Watch, because they have a different base of donors that they pander to, said that it is war crimes but not a terrorist attack. This is because terrorism is very difficult to define. The September 11th attacks, so airplanes attacking the United States, people call that terrorism, but would you consider Pearl Harbor to be terrorism? Even though in some cases it's even suicide planes. So it's very difficult to determine what is and isn't terrorism, and you're not going to find one definition that everyone can agree to. So interest groups will define it in a specific way, and it, like I said, normally meant to pander to their donors and the biases that set up the organizations, and it sort of balances everything out. One that's a direct result of October 7th is the current campaign going on in Gaza. So some would say that it is a genocide and others would not. And that mainly depends on who is funding your interest group. So as you can probably guess, the Human Rights Watch considers the current actions in Gaza to be a genocide, whereas AIPAC says that it does not meet their definition of genocide. And so what happens is politicians will point to whichever one they agree with and say, well, this is you know, this is how they defer to it and use that instead of defining genocide themselves. Now, why they fight over definitions of words is norm setting. Like anyone who knows anything about PR is that controlling language and how things are discussed is vital for any sort of public relations campaign to be successful. So many constructivists believe that interest groups contribute to framing effects, making it seem like there's only limited options. Great example is terrorism being a 1 or a 0, genocide being a 1 or a 0. It either is or isn't, where that's not really how a lot of things work in real life, is there's all these different shades of gray. Just sort of the overall theme for this lecture. But this whole false dilemma fallacy of either it is terrorism or it isn't, and there's no third way about it. We remember this with the internet and framing effects, or pre-internet media and framing effects. So what interest groups will do is put people into a lot of binary thinking a lot of the time, especially when it comes to definition of words. And this is what contributes to a sense of pluralism among interest groups and policy. By pluralism, we're just talking pluralistic or many types. So we talk about a pluralistic society, most people talk about it in terms of ethnicity. For example, China, the vast majority of people in China are Han Chinese, so we'd say it's not very pluralistic. Except Tang Dynasty China was super diverse. And of course, sorry, my master's in Chinese history is coming out. The Yuan dynasty also, because that was a lot of, well, they were under Mongol rule at the time. So compared to the United States is a lot more pluralistic than China. So there's more groups that make up this American society than Chinese society. But pluralism in interest groups is a bit different. It's this idea that interest groups will proportionately recognize the interests of society, and so it's important for Human Rights Watch and AIPAC to both have a voice because they balance each other out, or they'll be louder or quieter in proportion to how much support they have in a democratic society. But here's the question: is it all going to be proportional? Do AIPAC and the Human Rights Watch have proportional voices in policymaking relative to their popularity within the American population? Or if one has a disproportionate amount of influence more, is it effectively bypassing parts of the democratic process? Food for thought. And if they do bypass, is this elite theory, or this idea that core groups of elites control interest groups? This goes into the disproportionate wealth conversation, where the top 1% of people in the United States control 31% of all the nation's wealth. And they also have more spending money, more money to donate. And coincidentally, interest groups rarely advocate for taxing the rich. So there's this idea that what it ultimately serves to do is pit people against each other in ways that benefit the elites that pay for interest groups. Or a very roundabout way of saying elite theory is the idea that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And as I said, interest groups rarely advocate for taxing the rich because, well, coincidentally, we're not going to say because, but we're going to say they don't advocate for taxing the rich more. Coincidentally, a lot of them are funded by the ultra wealthy. So, of course, the ultra wealthy are going to investigate themselves and find that they did nothing wrong. mentioned earlier how interest groups will form their own super meta interest groups. Um, and it also mentioned how the more generic the name, normally the more unpopular or the more they're trying to hide what they do. World Wildlife Fund doesn't care that you know that they're pro-environmental. Um, American Petroleum Institute doesn't care that you know that they're pro-petroleum. What's interesting though is when the names get super generic. So, like I said, generic names normally considered to be bad news, and Citizens United is very generic. So, what they advocated for was this idea that corporations are people and that money is free speech. Therefore, corporations, as long as it's not directly to a candidate, but to a political action committee or a super PAC, corporations can fund election ads and stuff basically as much as they want. Now, this isn't scientific, but anytime you see lists of the worst Supreme Court decisions of all time, you're likely to run into Citizens United somewhere among. I think the worst is generally seen to be Plessy versus Ferguson, but Citizens United is up there because what it effectively does is puts big money even more into politics. And you see it referenced even in media today. There's a pretty performative but explicit scene in the opening of the Barbie movie where I guess, Barbie Supreme Court um, very explicitly rules that in their perfect society, they don't consider corporations to be people and they don't consider money to be free speech and strike it down. Like I said, very explicit, very performative, not very clever. But to see it referenced even like 2023 or whenever that movie came out is quite interesting. And that leads into what we talked about earlier with the ads that aren't directly tied to a campaign but are still very supportive of a candidate. I remember somebody asked if corporations legally count as people, and a corporation's found liable for killing somebody, can a corporation be given the death penalty? Which is part joke, part okay, if you want to be a person, um, you need to be a person and be more responsible. Of course, there's legal loopholes, and I'm sure they're not legally considered to be people the way you think. But point being, interest groups have a ton of influence. So we went over what interest groups are, different types of interest groups, and then their place in wider theory. Now, for part 2 on Thursday, we're going to talk about who they influence, how they influence, and how this fits into policymaking. Like I said, questions, comments, shoot me an email. If you're bored, shoot me an email. Yeah. See ya.